Hi guys, today we're going to look at the commercialization section of the Edexcel GCSE PE paper 2 area, and we're going to be focusing on particularly the golden triangle. Now, there generally isn't a question that directly links to the golden triangle. Sometimes it might be, but generally it's looking at a part of the golden triangle. So you really need to make sure you understand what the golden triangle is, and then how the individual parts work. So generally, what we need to be focusing on is sponsorship. We need to look at the role of the media, and we'll be looking at the positive and negative impacts of the media. We'll look at the impacts rule changes have had in sport and how media and particularly have influenced the rule changes, and we'll look at the impact on spectators. We'll also finish off by looking at a bunch of 9 markers and how we might revise for the 9 markers. So this is quite a lot of information on this screen, so make sure you pause it at some point to take better notes. So the first aspect is just the general concept of sponsorship, and in sponsorship we're looking at the relationship between business and sport. And it's broken down into a few areas. So if we start over here, we're looking at why sponsors might get involved with a certain sport or a team. So sponsors really want the ability to make money. So it's an investment for the businesses. They'll sponsor a sport or a team with the intention that they're going to get some payout back and make some profit. So the way they look at it, they look at the benefits for the actual sponsor is that there's going to be an increased income and profit base, usually through product sales and through their brand exposure. So a player who might be displaying their logo will be in the public eye, and the brand will be exposed to the public, and therefore more people are going to buy the product, and then the income goes up for the sponsors. They do run the risk of there's a negative aspect which we will talk about in a bit, but the sponsors could suffer if the performer they've chosen has a poor performance or goes out of form, or if they do something bad like taking performance enhancing drugs. The sponsor can suffer in terms of their reputation and being associated with the negative behaviours exhibited by the performer, and therefore they can have a decrease in income and sales. So that's one way to look at it, if it's why the sponsors, or what's the impact on the actual business, the sponsor. Okay, then we got the why some sports get more sponsorship than others. So and then we'll look at the advantages and the disadvantages of sponsorship. So certain sports will get more sponsorship than others based on the popularity of that sport. If that sport's getting a lot of media coverage, if it has a large fan base, and generally it's mainstream sports will get those sort of sponsorship deals rather than the minority sports. So obviously if a sport is popular and it's reaching masses, lots of people, if it's on TV and a lot of people are seeing it and they've already got a big base of fans, then a sponsor's going to invest in that sport because their brand is going to be out there and being given that advertising. So that's why certain sports pick up sponsorship over other sports. And then we've got this aspect of the advantages and disadvantages of sponsorship. So generally, the advantages are pretty obvious. So is associated with money. So generally, a sport or a team or a sport will gain better income because of the sponsorship, and they can invest that into facilities, resources, training equipment, coaches, and attract better players as a result. Their sport in general, rather than the team, the sport is promoted by the sponsors. So again, it gets an increased awareness of that certain sport. More people understand it and have seen that sport, so it increases people's awareness, which then impacts on grassroots level sport. The money could be invested at grassroots. Now grassroots is the very basic level of sport, the very beginner level of sport, and then we have an improved participation rate because more people are aware of the sport. They'll join the grassroots teams, so we get a bigger amount of people participating in the sport, and then more people will actually go to the games and attend the games because they're more aware, they're bigger fans, and they'll enjoy the sports. So that's all the advantages of sponsorship. The disadvantages can be that the control is taken away from the sport and given to the sponsors or the media or both. So the timing of matches is one example where the sponsors may dictate a fixture happening at a certain time, or the media might dictate the fixture times or the length of the period of the season. So it really impacts the timings. And they could also impact the rule changes, so they can enforce rule changes to make the games more interesting and therefore get more sales. Sometimes there's an inappropriate sponsorship. So a fast food company could sponsor a sports team which contradicts the nature of sport. It could be a gambling company or an alcohol company who might not necessarily be the best image for that sport. Also, a certain company might have a poor reputation, which then might impact on the sport negatively. Minority sports always suffer in this sort of argument because they're not on TV and they don't get a chance to go on TV. And other companies sports do rely on their sponsorship income, and some players make way more money in their income from sponsorship than they do from their performances. And if they rely on it and then that sponsorship gets taken away, they can experience financial difficulties. So that's a real busy and a big amount of area on sponsorship. Now bear in mind that there's a lot of information because there's been a lot of exam questions asked on this area, so it's definitely worth pausing, making notes and having a good revision on this area. So a slightly smaller area is the impact that rule changes have on games. Now what we're looking at here is how media might influence sport, and they might change the rules, and there's reasons why. So the first thing is, well, because they make the sport more attractive for a TV audience, and if it's more attractive, more people are going to be watching it and it builds up bigger, and therefore it will be more likely for that sport to be televised in the future. This increases spectators, and then obviously if they've got an increasing spectator base, the media can make more money selling advertising space and linking in the business side of it. So there are a couple of advantages to making these rule changes. So firstly, it does make this game more exciting and more interesting. It can, by increasing the attacking sort of options and potential points scored. So these are sort of some of the ways that the game becomes more exciting, increasing the pace of the game and the speed of the plays and things like that. That would also help that sport as well. This makes it all easier to televise, and once it's easier to televise, it gets stuck on TV and more people watch it. The other sort of point the exam board tends to make, it keeps it fresh, so it's interesting to a younger audience. Now, one of the examples I'll give you over here is from netball, where they've changed the scoring system, and they have essentially a 2-point scoring zone, and usually it's only 1 point within the D, and then there's a certain period within the game where the final part of the quarter where there is an opportunity to increase the points scored if you're shooting from further out. That's a rule change to make it more exciting, to increase the points scored and keeping the sport fresh, and therefore it's more attractive to be put on TV. And that's like example we've seen in the Netball Super League, definitely in England. Now, disadvantages. Disadvantages are that the timings of the games are changed, and because of these rule changes. Now, they don't. So just as a caveat on this area, there haven't been many exam questions asking about the disadvantage of this. So this is me just picking out areas that possibly could come up. So yeah, you could bring in the fact that timings of games and those sort of elements that could be linked to rule changes is a negative thing. It could increase the interruptions in the gameplay, and thus changing the nature of the game, from what it traditionally started as. The nature of the actual sport, the game, is changing. And then you could talk about the controversy around things like the rule changes, like the VAR. An example of a rule change is like in the championship in football, there's no VAR, but until they get to the playoffs, to get into the Premier League then when there is VAR. So they're going through the whole season without VAR until one game where the VAR is involved. And the same with the FA Cup. The early stages there's no VAR, so the Premier League teams who are used to VAR don't get the opportunity. Don't have VAR in their early games, and then as you get later on, they bring VAR back in, which might impact the lower level teams who aren't used to VAR. But it's a rule change mid-competition, so that could be a disadvantage. Okay, so we need to look at the impact on spectators, and there are essentially sort of two sort of positives, and then there are a bunch of negatives. So if we break down this into the positives first, so more money from the media and more sponsors can positively impact the spectators, because one, the team can buy better players and they can build better facilities. Now, better players makes the game more exciting and increases the standards of the game and the team, so that's a positive for the spectators. But whereas better facilities makes their experience, the spectators' experience, much more improved. So going to a better stadium, it's a more interesting and entertaining experience for the spectators. And then we have the impact of increased TV coverage. So think about when you watch TV and sport on TV, you could watch it through streaming, or you've got things like the red button, which is a BBC thing. And that's a benefit because you don't have to necessarily go and travel to watch your team. You can watch from home, so that benefits the spectator in that way. So these are the positives. Now the negatives are as follows, and there's a bunch of different negatives, and you could just pick them up as we go. So the first is that more people watching creates an increase in popularity, and then the teams and the companies build on that and then will drive the ticket prices up because it's in demand. So more demand, they'll charge more money for it. Now these 2 points both lead to expenses on the spectator. So sports generally now are behind paywalls, and what I mean by that is you have to pay per view, you have to pay for subscriptions. It's not just on free for view TV, so it's expensive to watch sports. And then obviously we talked about the driving up ticket prices with more popularity. It becomes too expensive for some fans to watch or to go to the games. Media controls sport, and in that regard, the kickoff times can be inconvenient, and sometimes we have Monday night football or Friday night football, and if you're a fan, say in the south of England, and your team are playing in the north of England on a Monday night, you can't actually get to those games, or if it's a 12 o'clock kickoff, you might struggle to get to a game if it's an away fixture. So it can be inconvenient for fans with the media controlling when the kickoff times is, and generally they're controlling it, so they're putting it on so they can get the maximum amount of sports on TV without competing games, so more people buy it, pay-per-view it. Some spectators suffer at the hands of corporate ticket sales. Now, corporate sponsors who sponsor the big events, they get given a set of tickets, which means there's fewer available for the actual fans. Often there's controversy because the corporate tickets don't get actually used. They're given away and they're not used. And the 2012 Olympics was criticised for that because there was lots of empty seats where a lot of the sponsors were given these ticket seats, and this areas of the stadiums were empty because of it. And then finally, we've got the normal interactions with adverts, and that just makes it less appealing to spectators if it keeps cutting to adverts. So the breaks in play to get advertising in can lead to a less enjoyable viewing experience. So other questions might ask you, well, what's the impact of commercialization or media on participation rates? And generally these are 3 to 6 mark questions. So make sure you know at least 2 sort of these lines to help you. And remember, we're trying to look at the outcome. And if you look at these outcomes first, more people want to play the sport, more people can participate. That's where you want to get to. So let's start with this area here. Media will increase the profile of the sport, which is giving it, advertising it, and increasing awareness to more people, and therefore more people are going to want to play it. If there's more funding of the sport due to the coverage of the sport, then that sport can reinvest that money into the grassroots level, and grassroots is getting more beginners playing, and therefore more people can participate. Increasing the knowledge of the media is used to help increase knowledge of the sport. It could be the rules, it could be the tactics, it could be the skills. That increases people's awareness of the sport, and then they know how to play the sport, which means they're more likely to take part if they know how to play it. And then finally, there's been questions on some sort of developing sports or minority sports, and what it does is it creates role models in those sports, which leads to a shop window effect. A shop window effect is if you're walking by something that's nice, a window that's nice, you look at the shop and you're like, oh, I want to go in there. So it increases this shop window effect with people, and it's also linked to awareness, where people are more likely to go into that sport because they've seen it on TV and they've seen the role models, and that in turn leads to more sponsorship, which then creates a bigger cycle. That money can be invested in the grassroots level again, and more people participating. So there's this other aspect of media which can be negative. Sensationalism in the media is a negative aspect sometimes. So generally, this is linked to sponsorship and media. So this is the full golden triangle in action at this point. So businesses will sponsor high-profile athletes who are role models, and they show excellent performance. So that might be your starting point in any question. Why does a team? Exam question might be, why might a sponsor withdraw their sponsorship? Why might a business withdraw their sponsorship of an elite performer? So firstly, why do they sponsor them? That's where you want to start with, and it's a few sentences. Just say an elite athlete, they might name one in the exam question, is a role model, or they show excellence, so therefore they gain the initial sponsorship. Now the exam question might set it up in terms of give you a scenario where someone's taken performance enhancing drugs, or they've been racist or something like that. So generally the exam question will tee it up and say, well, why might they withdraw this funding? And you say, well, if the player's done something wrong, you're referring to one of these. So if it's something like performance enhancing drugs or cheating, it's bad because it's deviant behavior, or it's bad because that person then becomes banned from the sport. If it's something like racism, it's bad because it's illegal, it's a hate crime. So you need to think of the question and read the question carefully and think, why is their behavior bad? Then why the sponsor would, or the business would withdraw their sponsorship. So in this sense, they don't want to be seen to support the behavior, don't want to be associated with the behavior. So they don't want to support deviance, they don't want to be associated with racism. If they do stay with the performer, then it can impact the sponsor, or they don't want to stay with the behavior because the sponsor, they don't want to stay with the performer because it tarnishes their brand. It can lead to negative publicity, and it can impact their reputation. And all of this is linked to money, and if that all happens to the sponsor of the business, they don't want to lose their sales or lose their customers. So they don't want to lose out on any money. All right, let's look at some 9-mark exam questions. Evaluate the impact of media and sponsorship has on professional sports performers. Now, when you look at this question, you want to break it down. It's into a few parts. We've got media, sponsorship, and we've got the impact it has on sports performers. So AO1, the key facts. The media, the money that these media and sponsorship bring in can allow the sports performers to become professional. So it increases money. That's a fact. Okay. AO2 is the link to the media. Why are they being sponsored? Because they're role models, they're in a public eye, they're elite performers, and that's why it's seen on the media and they are getting given sponsorship. And then finally, we can talk about things like we talked earlier. The media will dictate when events take place, and that can then impact on the sports performance. So if we look at that's AO1. The AO2 would be what's the impact it has. So if we're looking at the money and the professional side of it, this increases the pressure to perform, to stay at their top level game, pressure from coaches. And then if we went straight to the AO3 point, we've got the links to the judgment we can make. So that pressure and the money can lead to them becoming more deviant and cheating, or showing a win at costs attitude to maintain their standards because they're trying to meet the pressure and keep their money. If they're in the public eye, we talked about this AO1, any indiscretion can result in sensational news. It can be a lack of privacy. You know, they're in the media, so anything that someone does wrong when they're constantly in the media can then ultimately result in their loss of sponsorship, loss of funding, and loss of their income. And then if we're talking about the fact that media and sponsorship companies can dictate the events that sports performers have to go to, this means that the performers are a commodity. Now, a commodity is something that has value, something that can be bought and sold. And they're not looked as people, they're looked as a profit-making item. So that's an impact on the performer, because they lose their control and their power. And they're having then to compete in events that might be longer seasons, events that they might not usually compete in, and this could lead to increase of risk of injury or burnout or shorter playing careers, because they're committing so much to these events that are put on by their sponsors and media just to make their money. So that's a nice simple 9 marker, and when we break these 9 markers down, I want to break into the AO1, the key facts. And this question is sort of like the impact, and we've got to look at this question as its impact, and then always just finish off with a judgment. Is it good? Is it bad? Here's another 9 marker which could be going in any direction, and it's evaluate whether an under-15s football team should accept sponsorship from a betting company. And what we're looking at is gambling in this sense, but it could easily be switched out for alcohol, and that's been in a question before as well. So your key facts is, well, what's breaking the question down, what we're looking at sponsorship. So what's the benefit of sponsorship? Well, it gives you income. When we're talking about the income, can be used, the impact can be used to purchase equipment. And then that improves the judgment, it improves performance. You know, you can buy better, it attracts better players, better kit can lead to better training and therefore improved performance. If you're taking a sponsor, you are expected to display or advertise the betting company. Now, again, that could be alcohol, could be cigarettes. Now, it would potentially encourage players and fans and spectators to gamble more, because you know they're displaying the advertising, which is the whole purpose of sponsorship, to encourage more people to take part in the thing they're sponsoring, or the sponsor is they're trying to advertise and get more people involved in that sponsor. So if it's betting, more people like to gamble. If it's alcohol, more people like to drink. So you can just substitute gambling and betting out. And the negative aspects of that is, you know, it damages people's mental health. People become addicted to these sort of things. Damages your physical health if it's drinking. Then AO3 is illegal for under 18s. You know, it just distinctly looks at it's a moral thing here. Looks at under 15s. So you want to look at the moral side of it. Gambling is legal. Drinking is legal. Vaping, smoking is legal. Depends on what they could interchange that exam question for. The AO2 is essentially the impact. We're sending the wrong message out to the players, to the parents, to the fans. It sends the wrong message out if we're then sponsored by something that's contradictory to legal or illegal. And then that could impact the reputation of the club. You know, they're losing members, players, because parents don't want to be associated with that, don't think it's the right decision, so they leave the club. So always think, what's the key facts in the exam question? We're talking about sponsorship here, under 15s here. We're talking about the focus of the sponsors there. What's the impact? Okay, again, it's the impact of the focus, or the positive and negative impact, and then making a judgment, which doesn't always have to be negative, it's positive and negative. So break it down into those points. The other potential area you could have is an AO1 or AO2, AO3 point. for a 9 marker is just the general impact of the golden triangle, the general impact of media. So this is more of a pause and take notes question. And you really want to know what the advantages are and what the disadvantages are of media. And it's basically a regurgitation of everything we've talked about already now. But we've talked, and if you break it down to AO1, as in this section here, just the facts, AO2 is the sort of application, the impact, and AO3 is your sort of judgment. And we've got things like advantages is more money, more opportunities to watch, increased participation, things we've talked about already for the AO1s. And then we've talked about increasing facilities, using that money for facilities, could make the changes of the game to make it more exciting, increases the profile of minority sports, and produces role models. And then we could say, well, what's the expansion points, the judgments? Well, sports could reinvent themselves to make them more attractive to the sports. It could be used as a coaching aid for the managers and coaches. The media is you can record games and review them, watch tactics, watch highlights, and do some tactical analysis. And then if more people are taking part in sport, we're going to have a knock on in the NHS, less money invested in the NHS because everyone's healthier because they're taking part in sport. Disadvantages is more likely to be deviance because of the pressure. There's a disparity of exposure. So, the minority sports just generally don't get the viewing that the mainstream sports get. There could be rule changes, even though we said it could be a positive, it's also seen as a negative. And attendance rates can drop, which we talked about earlier, and that attendance rates leads to a lack of atmosphere. Kickoff times could be changed, we talked about that earlier. And then the sort of judgment points is minority sports would struggle to survive. There's an oversaturation of sport. In other words, there's lots of sport on TV, and it becomes a bit boring for fans because there's just too much to watch, and the media has too much influence on these sort of sports. And we talked a whole slide on that earlier. And the increasing rewards of all of this aspects, the pressure, the deviance, can lead to more gamesmanship and more deviance because there's a lot more money to be made. So that was quite a lengthy revision video on sport and commercialization. It does generally get asked every year. It does lend itself nicely to 9 markers, and a lot of this area has been covered in potential 9 markers that I've just gone through. So do spend your time revising this as a 9 marker, and if it doesn't come up as a 9 marker, at least you've learned it enough to get the 6 markers or the 3 markers that it could come up on. Best of luck in your exams. I hope this has helped, and I'll see you in another video.